Welcome to another edition of the Energy Week podcast. Ryan Ray solo today as Dr. Energy herself, Ellen Wald, is across the pond. She got invited to at a conference to do a presentation there, and so she will be back next week. So be sure to check her out at Energized Economy on Twitter for all of that information. However, we do have another doctor in her place. This is a man that I've enjoyed listening to various spots, which we'll get to in a second. But first, let me introduce him. He is Dr. Robert Murphy, who earned his BA in economics from Hillsdale College and his PhD in economics from New York University. He is the host of The Bob Murphy Show, co-host of Contra Krugman, and a featured guest where I heard him on The Tom Woods Show, which, I got to say, Dr. Murphy, Michael Malice, I think, is voted the top guest, but you should be a close number two. I always enjoy your time there. He is a research assistant professor at Texas Tech University and a senior economist at the Institute for Energy Research. Dr. Murphy, it is a pleasure to have you on today. How are you doing, sir? I'm
doing great, Ryan. Thanks. Although you missed the opportunity to say, but we do have another doctor in the house. That's what
yeah. So, been wanting to get you on here for a little while, and you obviously were gracious enough with your schedule. There's a lot we could cover. We're going to try to keep it somewhat short, but one of the things that I wanted to get you on to discuss is you are an Austrian economist, and so how you view trade and tariffs, and we're talking about OPEC and some of the stuff the Nixon administration might be a little bit different than what folks get from maybe their normal news outlets. So just take a few minutes and kind of break down Austrian economics and how it's different. And if you want to lay out some of the different schools of thought, I'll let you kind of answer that because you would know better where to start. But just kind of walk through the listeners why you may view things differently than what they're getting in other places like a Bloomberg or a New York Times or from Paul Krugman, especially.
Okay, yeah, sure thing. Yeah, so the Austrian school, the name derives from the fact that some of its, original founders were from the country Austria, obviously. It's not that we study the GDP of Vienna or anything like that. I also will say to audiences that, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Austria, right. And yet I am an Austrian economist. So the main difference, so there are schools of thought in economics. So there's the Chicago school associated with Milton Friedman. There's the Keynesian school, obviously associated with John Maynard Keynes. And it just means that they have a different framework or a worldview that they use when they approach economic issues. And so the Austrians differ most from the Keynesians, and the Keynesian perspective is really what people get if they're watching, the financial news at night or whatever, or the standard reporting in the press. Things like, retailers report that consumer spending is down going into November, so economists are worried about whether we're going to have strong growth in the fourth quarter to boost GDP. When they talk like that, it makes it sound like if only we had Christmas every month of the year, we would never have a recession, right? And so that's a very Keynesian mentality where it's focusing on what they call aggregate demand, that the whole goal of the economy is to keep up spending to keep people employed. And that's the way they think. And, if people aren't spending enough, well, then the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates to goose spending. And if that doesn't work, well, then the federal government needs to set in and run a budget deficit. And it's always about we need to make sure enough money is being spent. And the Austrians think that's exactly backwards, that in the Austrian view, the difficult thing, the economic problem, is figuring out what things to produce from our limited, scarce resources. Once you have stuff made, getting people to buy it and consume it, that's the fun part. That's not the hard part. The difficulty is saving and investing and producing stuff. The toil is onerous. So that's one huge difference. And the Austrians and the Chicago school are pretty similar, because the Chicago school economists associated again with Milton Friedman, people like that, they also are pretty skeptical about, big government spending programs or thinking that, just spending is the way to drive things. But and the Chicago and the Austrian schools tend to be very free market oriented. But even where the Austrians differ from the Chicago school is when it comes to their analysis of what causes the business cycle. And the Austrians think that it has to do with the banking system flooding the market with artificial credit, and that pushes down interest rates to unrealistic levels. That gives a false signal to entrepreneurs. So they start projects, they borrow money to start projects that actually there's not enough total savings to bring to completion. And that's what causes an artificial boom and then a bust. And so the Austrian remedy for that is to return money in banking to the private sector. that the Austrians think it was a mistake to have central banks be created and to have the government, monopolize no issue and take over the money function. Just like you wouldn't want the government in charge of TVs and cars, why would you put the government in charge of money? That doesn't make any sense. That's crazy. So that's the Austrian view. The Chicago school, they're more technocratic, I would say. And it's more like they're saying, oh, yeah, we can have a central bank and have the government set interest rates and centrally plan the money supply. Just make sure Chicago-trained economists are in charge of that. That's kind of their approach. So I would say the Austrians are actually the most consistent free market school that has a unique emphasis on what causes the business cycle. So I will stop there.
No, that's great. And just for more information on that, you did a discussion on your podcast, The Bob Murphy Show, which has, I think, 11 episodes out, so the listeners can go look it up. We'll link to it in the show notes. You did a discussion on the Fed. It was just you, I think, monologuing about the Fed. And you just had on a Chicago school guy in the last handful. I drove to Midland and back last week, so I got to catch up on the podcast. But you had a Chicago guy on as well. So if listeners want to hear more about that, those are two episodes that they could go and dig into in this format, which is what they're used to. So we'll link to the Bob Murphy Show in the show notes so they can check that out. Okay, so let's turn now with that kind of framework in place. We talk a lot on this show about, obviously, international issues, sanctions, tariffs, stuff like that. So first, let's just kind of back up from the Austrian perspective, if you will, the general thought on tariffs, good, bad, indifferent, maybe situational. What is kind of the general Austrian feel for tariffs?
Sure. And so here, the Austrian take is pretty much, the Austrians aren't unique or idiosyncratic in their approach to tariffs. The stuff I'm going to say here, most professional economists would probably generally endorse what I'm going to say, just so your listeners know this isn't like a weird Austrian take. If the issue is just, hey, the government needs revenue and we got to tax something, then you can make an argument that maybe tariffs are better than an income tax because there's more privacy if they're just taxing goods at the customs duties and things like that. But in our modern day and age, in this context, usually when people want to impose tariffs, it's not because, oh, hey, we have no choice, but we got to raise revenue somehow. The idea is that that's somehow going to be strategic and it's going to promote the domestic, workforce or employment. And so, like, for example, President Trump talking about tariffs, clearly there he's not saying that as a regrettable necessity because we need money. He's saying that this is going to help U.S. job growth and things like that. So most economists think that, no, that's just totally wrong. That, starting with Adam Smith and then particularly by the time you get to David Ricardo, so this was centuries ago, literally, that these notions have been destroyed. That, think of it this way, a tariff is just a tax. And so in general, it would be weird to say the way we're going to promote our economy is by levying more taxes. And, it's misleading to look at it and say, oh, well, it's a tax on foreigners who are trying to sell us stuff, because that still makes things more expensive. Like, it doesn't matter who the actual party is that literally hands dollars over to the U.S. Treasury. Either way, if you put a tax on something, that's going to interfere with the commerce between those two parties. Another way of looking at it is, so the basic problem is a tariff artificially distorts trade patterns. It makes foreign products more expensive than they really are. And so then Americans, if we're talking about the United States, when they're trying to decide, should I buy from a domestic producer or from a foreign producer, they're actually getting the wrong information from price signals. That they're being told that the foreign goods are more expensive than they really are. And so in general, what makes economic sense is for a country or a household or a business to buy, outside products. If outsiders can make them on better terms, then you can do it in-house. So just like a household isn't going to grow its own food and make its own car and stitch its own clothes, but the people in the household specialize in just a very few tasks that they're really good at, and then they earn money selling those services to others, and then they use the money to buy and, quote, import into the household stuff from other people. And so that same logic applies at the national level. It's just harder to see, but it's the same logic that maybe the U.S., should specialize in aircraft production and software design and wheat production, things like that, and maybe it should import sweaters from China and television sets assembled in China. Maybe that makes economic sense. But just give two more comments on this. to try to help your listeners see the underlying logic. Yes, if the U.S. government imposes a tariff, let's say on Chinese television sets, that might allow for the expansion in the U.S. of the television manufacture sector, or if they put a tariff on foreign-made cars, that might help the American-based automakers, but that comes at the expense of other Americans, right? So you create jobs in one industry or one sector, but you destroy it elsewhere. So by limiting the ability of foreigners to export into the United States, then that means foreigners have less money with which to buy our exports. So yes, you might help the domestic car industry with big tariffs, but you hurt American wheat farmers because now, foreign people don't get as many dollars, if you will, with which to buy American wheat. So you're not creating jobs on net. You're just rearranging them, and you're doing it in a way that's not efficient. And the last thing I'll say, I think this is a great quip from the economist Henry George. He pointed out, he said, notice that, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, when our country goes to war with another country, what do? We surround them with our Navy and blockade them. But yet, when it comes to, peacetime, what do? Is our government effectively limits the ability of outsiders to send stuff into our country. So it's like we impose a blockade on ourselves in peacetime. So if protectionism, if tariffs really are good, then why in wartime do we surround the enemy countries and try to stop trade from, occurring? Isn't that going to just let them create jobs, and won't that help their economy? But no, in wartime, we understand the common sense notion that if you stop goods coming and going from a country, you're hurting the people inside.
Right. So it's not you're basically saying it's not consistent to handle it in wartime this way, but in peacetime you handle it a different way. If you look at it logically, you say, well, okay, it doesn't really practically work itself out. Now they might argue, obviously, well, during wartime you treat things differently, but just from a economic standpoint, you're saying that the impact could be the same if you handled these various situations in a similar method.
Right, and obviously, yeah. So yes, the immediate response is to say something like, well, no, in wartime, it's a complete shutdown. And so, if the United States needs certain key things from foreigners, okay. But they, again, just pushing the logic. Okay, so yeah, why is it then, if you say, okay, certain thing, the U.S. can make just about anything domestically,
right?
In terms of technology or whatever, it just might be really expensive. And so it's the same logic. If you grant that, yes, and, an enemy fighting us, if they could somehow blockade us, they would do that and that would hurt us. Well, then again, a tariff is just like a partial blockade. So I'm just saying that, or another example, if it makes sense for the U.S. to have tariffs to promote domestic jobs, well, then would it make sense for everybody in the state of California? What if the governor of California put on a tariff against the other 49 states? Would that help Californians? And so I'm saying a lot of the protectionist logic that seems to make sense at the national level, if you applied it at different levels of jurisdictions, all of a sudden you'd probably realize, no, that's crazy. That can't be right.
Okay. All right. And part of the reason I wanted to ask about that at least was because we're going to get to next, which is talk about OPEC, which is obviously considered a cartel or a monopoly. Now, I've heard, I don't want to misquote you here, but I think it's maybe Tom has an episode about monopolies and why they actually could be good for the marketplace or not necessarily detrimental. What is at least your stance on OPEC as a quote-unquote cartel or a monopoly? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it irrelevant to the marketplace as we look at the oil and gas industry today?
Okay, it's a tricky question because it's intertwining a lot of government action, right? And so yeah, in general, the Murray Rothbard in his book Man, Economy, and State, I think has the classic analysis of this, where he goes through and shows how on a genuine free market, the idea of a monopoly producer and monopoly price is really kind of is a non sequitur. And so just to go down that path for just a little bit here. So the idea is that, look, defined narrowly enough, everybody is a monopoly producer, right? It's like when he was the heavyweight champ, Muhammad Ali was a monopoly producer. Like you could say, oh, he's a boxer, but you could say, no, he's Muhammad Ali. Nobody else can provide just those services. And so everything, if you think about it, like is kind of on a spectrum like that, where some guy's selling wheat, yeah, that's a pretty homogeneous product, and it's hard for him to distinguish it. But Nike selling its sneakers, that's not exactly the same thing as Reebok or Adidas or whatever the kids are wearing these days, right? So there's different shades there. You can see, or Billy Joel goes to give a concert, and you could say, oh, he's just a singer and performer and musician, but there's certain people that just want his service. So you can see. And so Rothbard's point was, that, whether you're the sole producer or whatever, that's not really the issue. The issue is just if it's a free market and there's open competition and free entry, that's the important thing. So if one firm totally dominates an industry and has almost all the revenue and sales, as long as they're not using coercion to keep out competitors, that must be because they're the best ones and consumers like them. And so why is that a bad thing? Right. So that's the issue. And then in practice, most of what people think of as bad monopolies, they have their privileged position because of government coercion, right? That like your local electricity provider is probably a monopoly, and that's because the local government just declares it, and regulates them, and
right.
fiddles with what they can charge.
Yeah, let me hop in there real quick, make sure I'm making this distinction. So if I had a well out here in West Texas and I was drilling one well for 100 barrels a day, I'm the only one who can actually produce those 100 barrels. Now, obviously, there's a lot of barrels that can come on the market from other places, but I have a monopoly, if you would say, on those 100 barrels. Whereas like the NFL, they have antitrust legislation with the United States which prevents and allows them to negotiate special contracts, which is, in fact allows them to be a monopoly. That's kind of the distinction you're making, I think, which is saying, well, obviously Ryan is one of 1,000, but the difference is I can't go start my own NFL like they have because they have special legislation, whereas anyone could go buy my lease acreage or drill a competing well and enter the marketplace at least more freely. Would that be kind of a good distinction to make?
The distinction, between in general that you're drawing is definitely correct. My only concern is with the NFL. I don't know enough about that, but I think there's also a thing where technically they're being exempted from antitrust legislation,
right.
which I don't agree with the antitrust legislation. You know what I'm saying? So,
but I'm saying like that would be a potential bad monopoly, if you will, because they have certain government protected rights that you would say, well, they have certain government. You're saying that there's a good and a bad, and the bad usually comes from government, which prevents entry.
Right.
Like the NFL doesn't allow players to come in until they're 3 years removed from high school graduation. Well, that's because they have certain governmental protections that allow them to make those rules. And even when people have sued in the past, they couldn't get past that. Whereas to drill a well, the threshold is a lot lower to get into that business.
Yeah. So that's definitely. I'm on board with that. Certainly with banking or something too. Like you can't just go open up a regular commercial bank and compete with Citibank. You got to get a charter and stuff. Or like in the medical profession, you can't just open up shop and say, okay, I'm a brain surgeon. Like it's literally illegal. You have to go and do things and jump through government hoops. It's not so that's what I mean. Whereas if the only reason that somebody is the only person selling product X is that he just makes the best thing like that, and nobody else can. When we say, I guess that's the way I put it. When you say, hey, that guy's got no competitors, or geez, nobody can compete with that firm. If what you mean is because they're so good that nobody can, like nobody can compete with Michael Jackson, in pop music, or nobody can compete with Michael Jordan. If what you're meaning is just metaphorically or a figure of speech because they're so good, then that's a good type of quote monopoly. But if you're saying no, legally nobody is allowed to compete with that person, well, then that's the bad thing.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So back to OPEC. So the problem there is that if it really were just a bunch of, companies that owned all huge stockpiles of oil, and they all just decided, let's get together and we're going to restrict output and raise world prices. That would be fine if it were a genuine market outcome, because there's economic incentives in place. In other words, that's not wasteful or anything. That there's reason if that really is a legitimate, genuine market outcome, we can walk through and explain why that's actually in the long run best interest of the consumer. Whereas if it's governments doing it, then they might be ignoring profit. That might not actually be the most profitable thing for them to do, and so that's why it gets kind of confused. Just like the U.S. government having regulations in place that prevent exploration and drilling in a lot of federal land, and so the development of U.S. based mineral resources is a lot lower than it would be if those lands were all privately held. I think part of what's going on there is that's because nobody really owns the U.S. federal government, right? If it were a monarchy and a king was in charge and was going to pass down the wealth of the kingdom to his son or something, they would have the incentives to behave in an economically rational manner. Whereas, with the way that we just have different groups of people in charge of the U.S. government for 4 or 8 years at a time, no one really has the incentive to maximize the economic value of the resources that the government technically owns.
Right. So let me ask you like this. One of the arguments I've been seeing floated out there since the last downturn, and we kind of had the prices go up and then kind of wobble at the end of last year, is there seems to be OPEC was the big bad enemy, and as Ellen likes to say, they're everyone's favorite target because they're some of the worst human rights offenders you can find are in OPEC. But I have seen this sentiment, at least in some pockets, where saying, you know what, the U.S. shale producers, because they are driven by, retaining their lease and they can't lose their lease, they have to drill, and they're not cohesive. Bob Murphy's exploration and Ryan Ray's, we don't have the same incentives on when we drill and how we drill. That's causing too much volatility in the market, whereas at least with OPEC, they can come together, they can sit down and say, you know what, we're going to curtail or we're going to ramp up our output. Now, compliance is always an issue with OPEC, but generally they could at least guide the market a little bit better, whereas the U.S. producers, there's kind of just the Wild West, and everyone has their own agenda, which makes for a more volatile market. What would how would you diagnose what we're seeing today with these two competing interests, and what would be an Austrian outlook on maybe how to fix some of those issues?
Well, yeah, so the great question, and yes, you're getting at what I was alluding to earlier, and I'm glad now we can put some more flesh on those bones of just my broad statements. The basic ideas, and this is what Rothbard was getting into, is saying, when people talk about a cartel and they say it and they use it in a pejorative sense, but how is that really economically different from a merger, right? And so,
right.
You've got some, forget oil, you just got some generic industry that has 13 companies and it's separate producers, and then maybe, they're losing money, and maybe 4 or 5 of them just join together. So then when the dust settles, there's a smaller number of firms and they each have more market share than they did before. So, there's not some law of economics that says the number of firms in the industry always has to go up.
Right.
Or that, at any given time, each firm, each industry has the optimal number, and any deviation from that would be bad, right? So, conditions change and people have to adjust to the new situation. So you're right. And also when it comes to oil production in particular, there's a lot of thorny problems, things like, you've got a bunch of different, wildcatters all located near each other geographically, and then maybe, 2 people drill down on what they think of as their own land, but what if they're tapping into the same underground pool? There's lots of issues, like tough issues with property rights and allocation, and, what exactly do you have the right to do on, quote, your land? And so a lot of that gets solved if you just allow for, some bigger company to come in and just buy everybody out, and then they would own the whole thing, and they would have all of the different entry points to that common reservoir, and so that would solve all the problem. There'd be no trade-off that if you owned everything, then if you pump one more barrel over here, that's one fewer barrel you can pump over there. So, and you don't care if you own everything. So that's what I mean, that a lot of this stuff, consolidation and having really big units in charge of making these decisions might make sense. And what we, cartel, like you say, if to just ensure stability and to make sure that, prices are in the range that ensures enough revenue to be earned to have drilling and exploration to keep the future supplies coming in decades down the road. Yeah. In addition to futures markets and forward contracts and things like that, certainly having some coordination between the major players might be a good thing to promote stability. So, but again, it's the problem with saying that is if these individual actors are coercive governments, then
right.
Then some of their decision is being driven not by necessarily pleasing their customers, but because of various other things that are not. So I'm not merely saying they're bad people and I don't like them. Mm-hmm. I'm saying no, the actual reasons that in a true market where all you can do is just have property rights and you have to, the way you stay on top is to please your customers and to keep your costs down. Somebody who thrives in that environment is the person, you want in charge of making decisions about how the resources are used. Whereas, somebody who takes over in a, military coup, that person's not necessarily the one who ought to be deciding what happens to Venezuela's oil, that kind of stuff.
Right. And so let me ask you like this. So ExxonMobil, let's say tomorrow they went and bought 100% of the Permian acreage. They can drill for it with XTO, they can pipeline it, and they can refine it. they would be a lot more responsive to the market, because if prices were going up, they want to increase their drilling. If prices were going down, they could roll back their drilling, however their business sees fit. But they would have to respond to the market because they have shareholders and investors, and they have to respond obviously to the consumer, what they're going to pay. Whereas if you insert nation here took over the Permian Basin, they might subsidize and give out, change the laws and do all kinds of things that the market may not be their first priority, which would be the consumer in this case. And so they would respond a little bit differently, which might not be and probably won't be in the best interest of people like me and you. I think that's kind of where you're, if I'm summarizing it correctly there.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. And you had a good point earlier when you were saying the way these lease contracts are designed might be suboptimal also, that, you get sort of like a use it or lose it framework. And so, just because private industry is involved in something doesn't mean the whole operation's magically good for consumers. If, the rules under which private industry is allowed to come in and exploit some of these resources that are technically under public ownership, as they say, you might end up doing it wrong. So yes, if they have maybe what the right thing to do would be for the federal government to completely sell off all that property into private hands and then let them decide the optimal rate of extraction. But yeah, if what instead they're doing is leasing the ability to pump out as much as you can or something like that, well then, yeah, the incentives are, okay, well, let's get it out of the ground because we paid good money for this lease. So you're right that's part of the problem. A different thing too is like governments that own forest land and then lease the right to outside timber companies to come in, and clear cut the forest, where there the incentives are all screwed up, that both sides of that transaction have the incentive to cut down more of the forest now rather than letting it, grow and flourish, because the people in charge of that right now aren't going to be in office 20 years from now, right? So if they, if they don't develop it now and sell off the rights now, then that means it's just going to, that value of that land will accrue to somebody else down the road, another temporary caretaker, who's installed by some different, administration. So that is the problem, that, the people running governments don't really have secure property rights and the resources they control. And so then, they don't do the right, it's the exact opposite of what the public thinks. The average person thinks that, those big bad oil companies are just going to use all the oil right away. Whereas it's the other way around, that private companies have the incentive, to maintain something for the future if that makes more economic sense.
Right. Okay. Well, Dr. Murphy, we asked for 30 minutes and we are up against the clock. So we had one more piece that we're going to get to. We will link to it in the show notes for the listeners. It is something I've heard you speak out on other podcasts, and maybe in the future we can get you on to talk about it. It's from the Journal of Private Enterprise, Removing the 1970s Crude Oil Price Controls, Lessons for Free Market Reform. It's an interesting piece on what happened back then. We'll link to it. Maybe we can get you on again in a few months to talk about that. Anything else we need to plug or promote before we get out of here today? I know we said Bob Murphy Show, Contra Krugman. Obviously, you're on the Tom Wood Show regularly. Anywhere else that folks might want to go find you at? It's the BobMurphyShow.com. I think that's, if people go there, that has links to everywhere else that they would want to find me. So let's give them that one. Okay. And to listeners, we'll talk to you next week.